Hey everyone, I've noticed that many of you are enjoying the videos, but most of you haven't subscribed yet. We're super close to hitting 1,000 subscribers, and your support could help us reach that milestone. If you're enjoying the content, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It really makes a huge difference and helps us keep creating more awesome content. Thank you so much for watching and supporting. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the remnants of our morning coffee, half-empty mugs resting on the counter like forgotten promises. The clinking of Emily's heels against the hardwood floor pulled me out of my daze, and I glanced up just as she grabbed her purse and slipped into her coat. "Running late again?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light, casual. But I felt it. Something was off. She smiled at me, that practiced, easy smile she'd been wearing for weeks now, the one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yeah, Trevor's got me working on a big project. Might be another late night." Trevor, her boss, the man I was beginning to resent without reason. Or maybe the reason was there, just hidden beneath layers I wasn't ready to peel back yet. I nodded, suppressing the knot tightening in my gut. "All right, I'll see you later then." She gave a quick wave, her fingers already typing something into her phone as she walked out the door. And that was it. No kiss goodbye, no second glance. I stared at the closed door for a moment longer than I should have. Something in her demeanor was colder, more distant than I remembered. Had it always been this way? Or was I imagining things? I shook my head and forced myself to move, focusing on the day ahead. But the image of Emily, smiling at her phone as she left, lingered like a shadow. The unease started as a whisper, barely perceptible, just a flicker of doubt I could push aside. But once it was there, it stuck. That smile she gave her phone. Who was it for? Trevor? A quick text before she stepped into the elevator? I tried to shake it off. I didn't want to be that guy, the one who questions everything, who overanalyzes every move his wife makes. But the whispers kept growing. That evening, she came home late again. I'd been waiting, watching the clock, the minutes stretching like elastic, snapping tighter with each tick. When she finally walked in, I could smell the faint hint of wine on her breath, though she didn't mention dinner, didn't mention anything. I asked how her day was, and she said it was fine. That was all. Fine. She slipped into the bedroom and closed the door before I could press further. I told myself to stop, that I was being ridiculous. But the small, subtle changes in her behavior were becoming impossible to ignore. Her phone, always within arm's reach, locked the second I glanced at it. The nights she spent at work stretched longer, her explanations shorter, clipped, like she couldn't be bothered to offer more than a few words. A few days later, I ran into an old friend of ours, Mark, at the grocery store. We chatted for a bit, catching up on the usual things, work, life, the same meaningless pleasantries. And then, casually, he mentioned seeing Emily out the other night. "It's great she's so dedicated to the job." "Man," he said, throwing a box of cereal into his cart, "I see her with Trevor all the time." "Those two are like a power team, huh?" I forced a laugh. "Yeah, she's been working a lot lately." Mark raised an eyebrow. "I bet. They're pretty close, aren't they?" It was a harmless comment said in passing, but it hit me like a punch to the gut. I didn't say anything, just nodded and mumbled something about being late for a meeting, but Mark's words wouldn't stop rattling in my head. Pretty close. How close? When I got home, I found myself pacing the living room, waiting for Emily again. I felt like a caged animal, trapped in the routine of waiting, wondering, and overthinking. Was it paranoia? Or had something shifted between us without me even realizing it? I thought back to when things started to change. It wasn't sudden, like a switch being flipped. No, it had been gradual, creeping in slowly, the distance growing inch by inch. The way she'd started dressing nicer for work, putting on perfume I hadn't smelled on her in years. The way she stayed out later, came home quieter. I'd noticed it all, but I hadn't connected the dots. Until now. That night, I decided to ask her. Direct, no dancing around it. I needed to hear her say it, needed to see her face when I brought it up. We were sitting at the dinner table, the silence between us growing thicker by the second. I put down my fork, wiped my mouth, and asked, "Is there something going on between you and Trevor?" Emily's reaction was immediate, too immediate. Her eyes widened just for a second before she masked it with a laugh. "What? Of course not. Why would you even think that?" It was the way she said it. The laugh was too forced, her denial too quick. I felt the knot in my stomach tighten. "I don't know. You've been spending a lot of time with him." Her eyes flicked down to her plate, then back to me. "He's my boss, Brian. It's my job." She said it with an edge, a hint of irritation that hadn't been there before. I pushed my chair back and stood up, unable to sit any longer. "It's more than that, isn't it?" Her fork clattered against her plate as she dropped it, exasperation clear in her voice. "Jesus, Brian. What are you even saying?" "I'm saying something doesn't feel right. You're not the same. We're not the same." I felt the anger rising in my chest, threatening to spill over, but I held it back. I didn't want to fight. I wanted answers. Emily sighed, stood up, and walked over to the sink, her back to me. "I'm just tired. Work has been exhausting. That's all." I wanted to believe her. I wanted so badly to believe that it was just work, that she was tired, that I was imagining things. But the doubt was gnawing at me, relentless. And as I stood there, staring at her back, I realized something. She wasn't going to tell me. Whatever was happening, she wasn't going to admit it. I went to bed that night with the weight of unspoken words pressing down on me, suffocating in the dark. I heard her slip into bed hours later, careful not to wake me, but I was already wide awake, staring at the ceiling. The space between us felt like an ocean, vast and cold. In the days that followed, I became obsessed with every detail. Every time she left for work, I watched her go with a sinking feeling in my chest. Her smiles were rare, and when she did smile, it felt rehearsed, like she was going through the motions. I started paying attention to the small things, the way her phone was always face down, the way she left the room to take calls, the way she would glance at me when she thought I wasn't looking, a flicker of something I couldn't place in her eyes. It was driving me mad, the not knowing. I felt like I was spiraling, caught in a loop of suspicion and doubt. Every conversation felt strained, every interaction loaded with unspoken tension. I stopped asking questions because I was afraid of the answers. But the silence between us grew louder with each passing day. I found myself replaying every moment in my head, searching for signs I'd missed. Had she been drifting away for longer than I realized? Was I just too blind to see it? I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, that I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. By the end of the week, the doubt had consumed me. I couldn't focus at work, couldn't sleep, couldn't think about anything else. I needed to know. I needed proof. And so I decided I'd surprise her at work. I knew I couldn't keep pretending things were normal. The tension in our house had thickened, growing into something tangible that I felt suffocating me every time Emily walked in. I had stopped sleeping well, tossing and turning with every creak of the floorboards as Emily tiptoed around late at night, coming home long after I had turned off the lights. I needed to get inside her head to see if there was anything left of the woman I'd married, or if everything we had was already gone. Conversations between us had become brief, clinical. I tried to pull more out of her, subtle questions about work, about Trevor, about her mood. She deflected each time, a masterclass in dodging, turning my questions into something benign or accusing me of overthinking. The harder I pressed, the more defensive she got. "So how's work going? You've been at the office a lot recently," I asked one evening, keeping my tone light, casual. I pretended not to care, but inside, every muscle in my body was tense. She didn't look up from her phone, her thumb scrolling aimlessly. "Same old, busy." "Busy with Trevor, right?" I probed, watching for a reaction. The way her eyes flickered, just for a split second, confirmed my suspicions. She gave me a tight smile, too practiced to be real. "You know he's my boss, Brian. Of course I'm busy with Trevor." That same sharp tone of irritation, the one that told me she had closed herself off from this conversation before it had even begun. My chest tightened, But I swallowed the bitterness creeping up my throat and didn't push any further. If she knew what I was thinking, she'd shut me out completely. I couldn't afford that. Later that night, after she had gone to bed, I found myself staring at her phone on the kitchen counter, the screen dim but just within reach. My heart pounded in my ears as I weighed my options, feeling like I was standing on the edge of something irreversible. I had never been the type to snoop, never felt like I had a reason to, but now the paranoia was too loud to ignore. I reached for it, locked. Of course it was. It always was. I had never even noticed before, but now the small, seemingly insignificant details screamed at me. Why lock it? What was she hiding? I pulled back my hand, disgusted with myself. This wasn't who I was. I couldn't turn into one of those paranoid husbands, obsessed with finding proof. If I wasn't careful, I'd push her further away. But even as I thought it, I knew I wouldn't stop until I had answers. There was no going back now. The next day, I decided to call a few of her close friends, trying to be subtle about it. Maybe they had noticed something. Maybe they had picked up on things that I was too close to see clearly. I called Jess first, one of Emily's oldest friends. "Hey, Brian, what's up?" she asked, her voice cheery, but with that underlying tension that had started creeping into all my conversations lately. No one knew how to approach me anymore, not when things felt like they were unraveling. "Just wanted to check in," I started, easing into it. "Have you seen Emily lately? She's been working so much that I feel like I barely see her." There was a pause, long enough to make me feel that familiar knot of dread tighten in my gut. "Yeah, she's been busy," Jess said carefully. "We haven't hung out much. I think work's been pretty demanding." "You think it's just work?" I couldn't help the edge creeping into my voice. "She seems distant." Jess hesitated again, and I knew I'd hit a nerve. "Brian, I don't really know. She hasn't said much to me about what's going on. Maybe you guys just need to talk." I forced a laugh, though it came out strained. "Yeah, maybe. Thanks, Jess." I hung up, feeling worse than before. Jess's awkward hesitation had told me everything I needed to know. No one was going to say it, but everyone knew something was wrong. Maybe they didn't know the details, but they saw the cracks. I wasn't imagining it. The next few days passed in a blur of anxiety and sleepless nights. Emily continued to come home late, smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't hers and wine she never mentioned drinking. The gap between us widened until we were like strangers occupying the same space, moving around each other with practiced ease, avoiding eye contact, avoiding the truth. I started checking her social media when she wasn't around, looking for clues, piecing together fragments of her life that she wasn't sharing with me. There were little things, new friends I didn't recognize, comments from Trevor that seemed a little too familiar. It was nothing concrete, but the tension in my chest told me it was enough. I needed more. I needed to know for sure. That's when I decided I couldn't wait anymore. I had to see for myself. So, on a Friday evening, while she was at work, I prepared. I packed a small dinner, something I knew she liked, and told myself it was a surprise. I could still play the part of the loving husband, just in case I was wrong. God, I hoped I was wrong. I left the house with that nervous energy buzzing in my chest, heart thudding with each step. My hands tightened around the handle of the bag as I got closer to her office. I walked into the lobby, past the receptionist, who gave me a polite nod, completely unaware of the storm raging inside me. I knew my way around her office building. She'd invited me to company events before, shown me around, even introduced me to Trevor once. But as I stood in front of her office door, staring at the polished brass nameplate that read, "Trevor Harrison, Executive Director," the ground beneath me felt unstable, as though everything was about to collapse. I hesitated, my knuckles just an inch from the door. I took a breath, steeling myself. This was it, the moment that would change everything. I pushed the door open, time slowed. The world narrowed down to the sight before me, and I felt my stomach drop out from under me. There she was with him, Emily, her blouse half unbuttoned, her hair tousled, leaning against his desk while Trevor hovered over her, his hands on her hips, their faces close, too close. My chest constricted, the air sucked from the room as I stood frozen, my vision narrowing to that one image burned into my brain. Emily's eyes widened as she spotted me, her mouth opening in shock, but the sound of her voice didn't register. All I heard was the blood rushing in my ears, my heart pounding like a drum, the dull roar of disbelief crashing over me in waves. Everything blurred. The only thing that made sense in that moment was my phone in my hand, the sharp click of the camera shutter as I took pictures, documenting the betrayal. They didn't even try to stop me. Emily's lips moved, but the words were drowned out by the rage boiling up inside me, too thick and consuming to allow anything else in. I shoved the door open wider, stepping inside, my hands trembling as I held the phone up like a weapon. Trevor backed away from her, his face pale, but I didn't care about him. I locked eyes with Emily, watching the shame and fear flicker across her face. "Brian," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It was like she was trying to speak to me from across a chasm, but I was already too far away. It's not, don't," I snapped, cutting her off. "Don't insult me by trying to explain this away." She took a step toward me, and I backed away, keeping the distance between us. "I didn't mean for you to find out like this," she started again, her voice shaky, filled with the kind of desperation I hadn't heard from her in years. "Find out like this?" I scoffed, feeling the venom rise in my throat. "You weren't planning on me finding out at all." Trevor stood frozen like a deer caught in headlights, but I didn't give him the satisfaction of my attention. This was about Emily, about the woman I thought I knew, but who had just torn my world apart. "I'm sorry, Brian," she said, her voice cracking, but it was too late. Sorry wasn't going to fix this. Sorry wasn't going to erase the images now seared into my brain. I turned on my heel, pushing past them, my legs moving on autopilot as I stormed out of the office. The hallway spun around me, but I kept walking, determined not to look back. My mind raced, a storm of anger, betrayal, disgust. The pictures on my phone burned in my pocket, but I didn't look at them. Not yet. I wasn't ready. All I could think about was how everything had just fallen apart, how the woman I had trusted had ripped everything away from me in a single moment. I stepped out into the cold night air, breathing deeply, trying to calm the rage twisting inside me. But as I stood there, staring up at the office building where my marriage had just crumbled to dust, one thing became clear. I wasn't going to be a victim. Revenge, calculated and cold, was all I could think about. I spent the next few days reeling, trapped in a vicious loop of disbelief, rage, and an endless procession of questions that had no answers. Every memory I had of Emily, every moment we shared felt tainted. Our wedding day, the long nights where we'd stayed up talking, even the arguments, they were all poisoned now by the image of her in Trevor's arms, laughing at me behind my back. I couldn't stop replaying that moment in the office, her wide eyes when she saw me standing there, the shock on Trevor's face. I wondered how long it had been going on, how many nights she'd come home to me smelling like his cologne. The anger was like a living thing inside me, simmering just beneath the surface, threatening to explode. I'd been blindsided, humiliated, but worst of all, I had trusted her. I had believed her when she said she was just working late, had accepted the lies because I wanted so badly to believe that she was still mine. But now I was done playing the fool. I wasn't going to let her and Trevor walk away unscathed. They thought they could destroy my life without consequences. They were wrong. I couldn't confront her yet. Not directly. I wasn't ready for that, not while the rage was still raw, pulsing in my chest. So instead I channeled it into something I could control: revenge. I sat down at the kitchen table, my phone in front of me, the photos of their betrayal glowing on the screen like a burning reminder of what they'd done. I would make them pay for this, but I had to be smart, calculated. This couldn't be some impulsive outburst. It had to be something they wouldn't see coming. I needed to hit them where it would hurt the most, publicly and professionally. First, I started gathering evidence, more than just the photos. I needed solid proof of their affair, something I could use to ruin them. I went through Emily's social media accounts again, piecing together fragments of her conversations, looking for any public clues about her and Trevor. Every time I found a comment from him on one of her posts, I felt the rage coil tighter, but I kept going. I wasn't just doing this to hurt her anymore. I needed to destroy them both. That was when I remembered something. A company event was coming up. I'd seen the invitation on the kitchen counter weeks ago, some corporate fundraiser Trevor's company was hosting. Emily had mentioned it in passing, but now I saw it as an opportunity. Both of them would be there, surrounded by their colleagues, bosses, friends, the perfect stage for their downfall. I could feel the plan taking shape in my mind, the pieces falling into place, but I couldn't act alone. I needed allies, or at least someone to help me spread the word. And that's when I thought of Mark. He'd mentioned seeing Emily and Trevor together before. I was sure he'd picked up on more than he'd let on. I gave him a call, keeping my tone casual, testing the waters. "Hey man, you busy?" I asked, trying to keep the anger from me leaking into my voice. "Not really, what's up?" I hesitated for a second. "You remember when you mentioned seeing Emily out with Trevor a few times? You weren't the only one, were you?" There was a pause on the other end, long enough to tell me he'd been holding back. "Look, Brian, I didn't want to get involved, but yeah, I've seen them a few times. Late dinners, drinks after work. I thought it was weird, but I didn't want to say anything." The anger flared again, but I kept it under control. "You did the right thing not saying anything," I lied. "I just wanted to know. There's something going on between them, Mark. I found out." "Jesus, man." "I'm sorry." "I don't want sorry," I said, my voice hardening. "I want help." He was silent for a moment. "What are you thinking?" "Let's just say I'm not going to let them get away with it. You'll see soon enough." Mark didn't press for details, but I knew I had him on my side. And once the news started to spread, he would be the first to help fan the flames. With the event looming, I worked out the rest of my plan. I gathered everything, every damning photo, every suspicious social media post, every late-night excuse that now reeked of lies. I put it all together, saving it for the moment I needed it most. The company event was a week away, and by the time it came, I would be ready. That week was a blur of tense silence between Emily and me. She had no idea I knew the full extent of her betrayal. I watched her carefully, studying her every move, every smile she faked, every time she checked her phone with that flicker of guilt in her eyes. I didn't ask where she was going anymore. I didn't need to. I knew she was with him, and soon so would everyone else. The night of the event finally arrived. Emily spent hours getting ready, more time than I'd seen her put into anything in months. She looked stunning, her dress clinging to her body in all the right ways, her makeup flawless. But it was wasted on me. All I saw was the woman who had lied to me, betrayed me, and now she was walking into her own downfall, completely unaware. "You ready?" she asked, giving me a bright smile that made my skin crawl. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Let's go." We arrived at the event, and it didn't take long for her to slip away from me. I watched her make a beeline for Trevor, the way they exchanged quick, secretive smiles. I felt the bile rise in my throat, but I swallowed it down. I had to stay calm. Timing was everything. I mingled with the crowd, blending in, watching from the shadows as they interacted, their little world still intact, completely oblivious to the bomb I was about to drop. I saw Mark across the room giving me a subtle nod. He knew. He was ready. As the night went on, the crowd thickened, drinks flowed, and people loosened up. It was the perfect moment. I pulled out my phone, opened the folder of evidence I'd compiled, and sent the photos to a carefully selected list of people. Trevor's colleagues, his superiors, key figures at the company. The captions were short, direct and damning. There was no hiding the truth now. I watched from across the room as phones started buzzing, eyes widening as the photos spread like wildfire. It didn't take long for whispers to start, people glancing in Emily and Trevor's direction, their judgmental stares cutting through the room like knives. Then it happened. Someone approached Trevor, phone in hand, showing him the photos. His face went pale, his hands trembling as he tried to explain, tried to deflect, but there was no escaping it. Emily stood frozen beside him, her smile fading into a look of horror as she realized what was happening. I could see the panic in her eyes as she scanned the room looking for me, but I stayed in the shadows watching it all unfold. This was their reckoning. The humiliation they had tried to avoid was now public, and there was no going back. Trevor's boss approached him, face twisted in disgust, his voice low but angry as he demanded answers. Emily tried to step in, but she was quickly silenced by the growing crowd, the whispers turning into pointed accusations. And then, just like that, it was over. Trevor was led out of the room by security, his career in ruins. Emily, too shocked to speak, stood there alone, the life she'd carefully crafted crumbling around her. I stepped out of the shadows then, walking up to her, my heart pounding with a mix of satisfaction and something else I couldn't quite name. She looked at me, her eyes wide with fear, tears starting to pool. "Brian, how could you?" I stared at her, the rage I'd been holding on to for so long finally subsiding. I felt hollow. "How could I?" I said, my voice cold. "How could you?" She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She knew it was over. We were over. I walked out of the event, leaving her standing there in the wreckage of her own making. The cool night air hit my face as I stepped outside, but instead of feeling the rush of victory I had expected, I felt empty. Revenge had been the only thing keeping me going, but now that it was done, I wasn't sure what came next. The satisfaction I had imagined felt hollow, fleeting. I had won, but at what cost? As I walked home alone, my mind raced with thoughts of what came after this. Emily was destroyed. Trevor was finished. But where did that leave me? For the first time, I wondered if I had really gained anything at all. I walked home that night with a strange sense of emptiness gnawing at my gut. The revenge had been swift and brutal, exactly what I had planned, but it didn't feel right. I should have been satisfied, ecstatic even, at how thoroughly I'd exposed them. But that hollow feeling crept in, refusing to let go. Emily's face when she realized what I had done kept flashing in my mind. The tears in her eyes, the silent question hanging between us. How could you? It was almost laughable coming from her. Yet, instead of the sharp satisfaction I had anticipated, it felt like I had just struck a blow at something fragile inside me. I kept pushing that feeling down, burying it beneath the cold, hard logic that they deserved it. But that didn't stop the echo of doubt gnawing at the edges of my resolve. I needed to double down. There was no turning back now. The days after the event were chaotic. Word spread quickly, faster than even I expected. Trevor had been placed on leave pending an internal investigation. And Emily, well, her reputation had been shredded. Every whisper, every sideways glance at the office was a reminder of her humiliation. My plan had worked, but not everything had gone as smoothly as I hoped. It didn't take long for Emily to start her counterattack. She was smart, I had to give her that. She played the victim, spinning the story that I had lost my mind, that I had fabricated everything out of jealousy, that I was spiraling out of control. And it wasn't just her. I heard from mutual friends, people I thought would stand by me, questioning my mental state, wondering if I was really okay. Emily had planted those seeds, and now they were blossoming into doubt. People began to reach out, concerned tones, subtle questions. "Are you sure you're not overreacting, Brian?" Maybe it wasn't what it seemed. I was being painted as the unhinged husband who'd gone off the deep end. She was trying to gaslight me, turn me into the crazy one. I wasn't having it. I had anticipated this, though, and I wasn't about to let her win. I had evidence, hard proof. If people wanted to doubt me, I would show them the truth. I started sending the photos around, making sure everyone saw the truth of what she'd done. There was no mistaking it, no room for interpretation. The images of Emily and Trevor were explicit enough, their betrayal captured with undeniable clarity. The more I pushed, the more it became impossible for her to deny. But it wasn't enough. It turned out that people didn't care as much as I thought they would. Sure, some of her friends turned on her. Trevor's career was probably over, but outside of that, the world just moved on. My carefully constructed plan was beginning to feel pointless. People talked, but not for long. Scandals fade and new gossip takes its place. Life goes on. One evening, as I sat in the dark staring at my phone, I realized something. This revenge, this meticulously planned destruction, had consumed me. The anger I'd been carrying for weeks had become a permanent fixture in my life, and now, with nothing left to focus on, I was just tired. The betrayal, the hurt, the constant need to hurt her back, it was starting to wear me down. What was I really doing here? What had I won? Emily and Trevor were ruined, but I felt like I had destroyed myself in the process. I thought about reaching out to someone, maybe Mark, maybe another friend. But the truth was, I had pushed everyone away in my pursuit of this revenge. Even Mark, who had helped spread the rumors, seemed distant now, wary of the man I was becoming. And then one night, something unexpected happened. I was at home nursing a drink and staring blankly at the TV when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Emily. "We need to talk. Please." My first instinct was to delete it, to ignore her plea, but something in me hesitated. I stared at the screen for a long time, replaying everything in my mind. What could she possibly have to say now? Was this another manipulation, another attempt to twist the knife in my back? Or was it something else? Against my better judgment, I replied, "Why?" A few seconds passed before she responded, "I owe you an explanation." I couldn't help the bitter laugh that escaped me. An explanation? Now it felt ridiculous. But part of me, some sick, twisted part, wanted to hear her out. Maybe I wanted to see her squirm one last time. Maybe I just needed some sort of closure. We agreed to meet the next evening at a coffee shop. Neutral ground. The next day I walked into the small cafe, my chest tight with anger and anticipation. Emily was already there, sitting at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. She looked worn, her face pale, her eyes tired. Gone was the confident, secretive woman I had been watching for weeks. She looked broken. I didn't sit down right away, just stood there waiting for her to speak. "Brian," she started, her voice barely above a whisper, "I know you hate me. I know what I did was unforgivable." I stayed silent, not willing to let her off the hook with an apology. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it," she continued, her eyes filling with tears. "But I need you to know, it wasn't just about Trevor. It wasn't about some affair." I clenched my jaw. "What was it about then? Enlighten me." She looked down at the table, her fingers trembling around the mug. "I was lost, Brian. I felt trapped. I know that doesn't excuse anything, but I felt like I was suffocating in our marriage. You were so focused, your way, on your life, and I didn't know how to reach you." I shook my head. "So your solution was to sleep with your boss?" Her tears spilled over then, and she wiped them away quickly, trying to keep her composure. "I'm not trying to justify it. I want you to understand that I wasn't doing it to hurt you. I was doing it because I didn't know how to fix us." I wanted to scream at her, to tell her how ridiculous that sounded, how selfish she was. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the way her voice cracked, the rawness in her words. Maybe it was because deep down I knew I had been distant. I had let our marriage drift, had assumed everything was fine while I focused on my career, on my own life, but none of that excused what she'd done. I took a deep breath. "You should have talked to me, Emily. You should have said something." "Anything. But instead, you destroyed everything." She nodded, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I know I did, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life." There was a long silence between us, the weight of everything we'd been through hanging in the air. I didn't know what I was feeling anymore. Anger, sadness, maybe a strange mixture of both. Finally, I stood up, looking down at her one last time. "I'm done, Emily. We're done." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with desperation. "Brian, please." But I didn't wait for her to finish. I turned and walked out, leaving her there in that cafe with her guilt, her tears, and the wreckage of the life we once had. The cool night air hit me as I stepped outside, and for the first time in weeks, I felt lighter. Not free, not healed, but lighter. The anger was still there, the betrayal still raw, but I had said what I needed to say. I had made my decision. I wasn't going to let this destroy me anymore. As I walked down the street, I thought about the future, about what came next. Revenge had been my only focus for so long, and now that it was over, I wasn't sure what was left for me. But I knew one thing: I wasn't going to be defined by this, by her. It was time to start over, to rebuild, to find myself again. And I would. I walked out of the cafe, but the conversation with Emily still played over in my head. Her words echoed, "I didn't know how to fix us." She wanted to frame this as some cry for help, but to me, it was just another excuse, another layer of betrayal. No, there was no salvaging this. Everything between us had been scorched, but it wasn't over. Not yet. There was a box of my things still at the house. I could have asked her to send it over or even have someone else get it, but I needed this confrontation. Not to talk, not to hear more excuses, but to end things once and for all, face to face, without the safety of a public space, without any witnesses. I needed her to feel the full weight of what she'd done. The next day I sent a message. "I'm coming by tonight to pick up my things. I want you to be there." Her reply came within minutes. "Okay." There was something unsettling about how quick her response was. Maybe she was expecting a scene. Maybe she thought I'd give her one last chance to explain herself. But this wasn't going to be a conversation. I wasn't looking for closure or understanding. I needed to look her in the eye one last time, see the wreckage of what she'd done, and walk away for good. I arrived at the house just after sunset. The front light was on, a warm glow spilling onto the driveway, but inside the place was dark, save for a faint light in the living room. The door was unlocked. I stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of something faintly floral, her perfume lingering in the hallway. It felt like walking into a tomb, memories pressed into every corner, every shadow. The life we'd built together was dead now, and the house felt like a mausoleum. Emily was waiting in the living room, sitting on the edge of the couch, her hands clenched together in her lap. The tension in the room was suffocating. She looked up as I walked in, her face pale, eyes red and swollen, as if she'd been crying for hours. I didn't care. "I packed your things," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She gestured toward a cardboard box near the doorway. I glanced at the box, then back at her. "That's it?" I asked, my voice hard, the edge sharp enough to cut through the silence. Emily swallowed, her throat bobbing as she struggled to find her words. "Brian, I know you hate me. I know I destroyed everything. But I never meant to hurt you like this. I thought we could—" "Stop," I cut her off, the word hanging in the air like a final blow. "You thought we could what? Talk? Fix this?" I scoffed, shaking my head. "We're beyond that. You don't get to rewrite the narrative now. You knew exactly what you were doing. You chose to lie to me. You chose him." Her face crumpled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I made a mistake. I was lost, Brian. Don't give me that lost crap," I snapped, the anger rising again. "You were selfish. You didn't care about me, about us. You wanted something else, someone else, and you didn't even have the decency to end things before you started screwing him." She flinched at the harshness of my words, but I didn't stop. I wasn't here to comfort her. I was here to bury this. "You think I didn't see what you were doing? You think I didn't know you were laughing at me behind my back?" I leaned in, my voice lowering to a dangerous whisper. "But guess what? Everyone knows now, Emily. Everyone sees you for who you really are." Her breath hitched, and she looked away, unable to meet my gaze. I took a step back, the weight of the confrontation starting to settle on my shoulders. I had imagined this moment so many times, replaying it over and over in my head, thinking it would bring me some kind of release. But standing there, watching her unravel, I realized how empty it all felt. You want it out? You got it, I said, my voice cold, final. You don't have to pretend anymore. Emily lifted her head, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Brian, please, I know I can't fix what I did, but I don't want to leave things like this. We've been together for so long. Can't we just... No, I said firmly. You don't get to decide how this ends. Not anymore. I walked over to the box and picked it up, the weight of it nothing compared to the heaviness in my chest. I turned to leave, but something made me pause. I looked back at her one last time. You don't even know what you lost, do you? Emily's face crumpled again, but I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked out, the door closing behind me with a soft click. As I drove away, the silence in the car was deafening. No music, no distractions, just the hum of the engine and the sound of my own breathing. I had thought this confrontation would bring me closure, but all it had done was confirm what I already knew. There was no going back. When I got home, I dropped the box by the front door and collapsed onto the couch, staring at the ceiling. The confrontation had been draining. Not in the way I'd expected, but in a way that made me feel numb. I had hoped for a sense of finality, some kind of resolution. But instead, I just felt hollow. I thought about everything I'd done, exposing her affair, ruining Trevor's career, humiliating them both in front of their colleagues. I had gotten my revenge. I had destroyed everything they'd built. But at what cost? The anger, the bitterness, it was still there, simmering beneath the surface. But now there was something else, a deeper, gnawing emptiness. I had thought that by tearing them down, I'd finally feel whole again. But instead, I felt more lost than ever. The truth was, I didn't recognize the person I'd become. The man who had once been driven by love, by loyalty, had been consumed by revenge. I had thought that by destroying Emily, I'd find some kind of justice, but instead, I had lost myself in the process. I didn't know what came next. I had spent so long plotting and executing my revenge that I hadn't thought about what life would look like after. There was no sense of victory, no triumph, just an endless void. I glanced at the box by the door, the remnants of my life with Emily packed away, as if that could contain the years we had spent together. It all felt so pointless now. I stood up, grabbed the box and carried it to the trash. There was nothing worth keeping, nothing worth holding on to. As I threw it away, a strange sense of release washed over me. Maybe this was the beginning of something new. Or maybe it was just the final step in letting go. Either way, I was done with the past, done with her. As I walked back inside, the emptiness still lingered, but this time it felt different. Less like a wound and more like a clean slate. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to think about the future. Not the revenge, not the betrayal, but what came after. Maybe, just maybe, there was something more waiting for me on the other side of this. In the days that followed, I found myself staring at the pieces of my life. Emily's betrayal, my revenge, the wreckage left behind. It was all still there, but the sharp edges had dulled. The anger that had once driven me was now a distant echo, like a storm that had finally passed. I spent hours reflecting on what had happened, thinking about the choices I made. I had wanted justice. I had wanted them both to pay for what they did, and I had gotten what I wanted. Trevor's career was over, his name dragged through the mud, and Emily's reputation had shattered beyond repair. But in the quiet aftermath, the question I hadn't been ready to face was whether the revenge had healed me, or if it had just left me emptier. There was no satisfaction in their downfall, only a hollow sense of closure that felt more like the end of a long, exhausting chapter than a victory. Emily had reached out again, sending me long, apologetic messages, but I didn't respond. I had nothing left to say to her. We were finished. I took long walks, letting my thoughts unravel as I tried to make sense of what came next. For so long, my mind had been consumed with vengeance, plotting my next move, anticipating her reaction, calculating how to hit them where it hurt most. Now, with no enemies left to fight, I felt lost in a way I hadn't expected. One evening, as I sat on my couch, I thought about reaching out to someone. Mark maybe, or an old friend I hadn't spoken to in months. But I realized that even though I had been surrounded by people, I had isolated myself during the entire ordeal. Revenge had taken me to a dark place, pushing everyone away. I hadn't just ruined Emily and Trevor's lives, I had let it consume mine. The loneliness was a cold reminder of how far I had let myself spiral. I couldn't go back to that version of myself, but I wasn't sure who I was anymore either. I had to rebuild, something new, something better. But where did I start? I decided to move out of the apartment I had shared with Emily. Staying there, surrounded by memories of what we had once been, was suffocating. Every corner of that place reminded me of her, of us. I needed a fresh start, somewhere that didn't carry the weight of our past. I found a small place across town, a modest one-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood. Moving out was harder than I expected. It felt like closing the book on a part of my life that, despite everything, I had invested so much in. But it also felt freeing, like I was finally stepping out of the shadows of what had happened. The new apartment was bare, but I liked it that way. It felt like a blank canvas, an empty space that I could fill with new memories, on my own terms. Once the move was done, I turned my focus back to work. For weeks, I had let everything slide while I was wrapped up in my personal mess. But diving back into my projects gave me a sense of purpose, a distraction from the lingering emptiness. It wasn't easy, though. There were moments where I'd catch myself drifting, thinking about Emily and the mess I had left behind. But each day, those thoughts became a little less painful, a little more distant. About a month after the move, Mark reached out. He wanted to grab a drink, catch up, see how I was doing. I hesitated at first. Part of me wanted to keep retreating into myself, to stay isolated from the world. But another part of me knew I couldn't keep doing that forever. I needed to reconnect with people, to rebuild the relationships I had let wither. We met at a small bar near my new place. As soon as I walked in, Mark gave me a look, a mix of concern and relief. "You look better," he said, clapping me on the back. "How are you holding up?" I shrugged, taking a sip of my drink. "I'm getting there," I said. And for the first time, it felt like the truth. We talked for a while, avoiding the obvious topic at first, but eventually it came up. "I heard about what happened with Emily and Trevor," Mark said carefully. "It's brutal, man, but you did what you had to do." I nodded. "Yeah, I did." There wasn't much more to say. I'd already replayed it all in my mind 1,000 times. I didn't need to rehash it with him. "What's next for you?" he asked, his eyes scanning my face as if he was trying to gauge how deep the damage still ran. "I don't know," I admitted. "I'm trying to move on. Start fresh." He nodded, lifting his glass. "To starting over." I clinked my glass with his, feeling the weight of those words sink in. Starting over. That's what this was about now. Moving forward, leaving the past behind. I wasn't looking for redemption, but I wanted something more than the emptiness that revenge had left me with. Over the next few weeks, I made small changes. I went out more, reconnected with old friends, even signed up for a gym near my new place. I didn't want to wallow in the past anymore. I had spent too much time letting it control me, define me. Now it was about figuring out who I was without it. One day while I was out for a run, I passed a couple walking hand in hand, laughing about something as they strolled down the street. For a moment, it stung watching them, seeing what I had once had with Emily. But then the feeling faded. It didn't feel like a loss anymore. It just felt like a part of life that had run its course. I wasn't ready to date again. Not yet. The wounds were still too fresh, and I knew I needed time to heal. But I wasn't closed off to the idea either. There would be a time, eventually, when I'd be ready to let someone in again. But it would be different. I would be different. The days stretched into weeks, and slowly I began to feel a sense of peace settling over me. I wasn't completely healed, maybe I never would be, but I was starting to accept what had happened. I didn't think about Emily as much anymore. When I did, it was with a sense of finality, not regret. I had done what I needed to do to move on, And now it was time to let go of the anger that had driven me for so long. One evening, as I sat on the balcony of my new apartment, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I realized something. I had been defined by Emily's betrayal for so long that I had forgotten who I was outside of it. But now, sitting here, in this new place, with the future stretched out before me, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It wasn't a grand epiphany or a dramatic moment of clarity. It was quiet, subtle, like the first breath of fresh air after being trapped in a dark room. I wasn't defined by what had happened anymore. I was defined by the choices I made from here on out. I wasn't the man who had been betrayed. I wasn't the man who had sought revenge. I was just me. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. As I watched the last of the sunlight fade, I knew I was ready. Ready to rebuild, to move forward, to find happiness again, on my own terms. The scars were still there, but they didn't control me anymore. Tomorrow, I'd wake up, put one foot in front of the other, and keep moving forward. I didn't know where I was headed, but for the first time, that uncertainty didn't scare me. It felt like freedom.